Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. Just checking the producer. We're live now, right? Thank you. Excuse me, I'm getting used to the platform here. I want to talk about opportunities with green bonds. You've seen over the last couple of years an extraordinary growth in the global thematic bond market, green, social, and sustainability. There's a bit of a reason why that's happening. I want to talk about that, and I want to come back to the opportunities for companies, but also investors in Turkey to use this really incredible phenomena that we're seeing around the world now. You're aware of the underlying challenges that we currently face. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report of just a couple of months ago was slightly terrifying in terms of its what it said about what's likely to happen to the world in the future. It says essentially that unless we get emissions down by 50% in a few short years, 8 years, we face a fairly catastrophic future. And that'll be not just rising sea levels. You heard all of these kinds of stories around climate change, increased weather severity, storms in Izmir that will be triple the strength we've seen before, but we'll see floods and droughts and so on. The real impact of climate change, we now know from studies of past incidents of climate change, notably the 1600s, when we saw a world of 2 degrees cooling, thanks to the killing off of American Indians with smallpox and measles in the 1500s, we wiped out about 95% of the population of the Americas. Whole civilizations disappeared under the jungles of the Amazon. We now know from recent radar mapping that we saw a massive forestry growth. From tree ring studies that Stanford University has done, we now know there's a direct correlation between the carbon drawdown that happened in the 1500s and then the global cooling that we experienced in the 1600s with a bunch of other things that got triggered by that, such as volcanic activity, etc. In the 1600s, we saw a century. This is how people are going to experience climate change, of failed crops again and again, winters that would never end, of famines, of wars, and of pandemics. The pandemic we've just experienced is something that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Health Committee has been predicting for 30 years. Been saying that we will see in the 21st century, thanks to climate change, the destruction of biodiversity, repeated, regular, frequent near pandemics or pandemics. Well, we've had about 5 so far this century, close to pandemics. We have one that's actually got away from us. And we can expect to see more of these going forward. War. Well, we do have a war not far from Turkey underway, which, if you look at the underpinnings of it, is actually a war being waged by a country that is a petrostate country using revenues, frankly, from the European Union to finance it. The net extra revenue that Russia has earned from oil and gas from the European Union since last autumn, when, according to Fatih Birol of the International Energy Agency, they engineered a price rise of energy prices in Europe, that net extra revenue has more than paid for the war. This is a petrostate war. We're going to see more of these as we deal with the volatility of change as a result of climate change and the policies to address that. And then famine, well, actually, we're beginning to see a terrifying spike in food prices around the world as a result of the war across the Black Sea, with the collapse of exports from Ukraine and from Russia because of sanctions, food price spikes across the northern African coast and in other countries of the world. And of course, we know from the revolutions of some 10 years ago that food price spikes lead to political instability. Let me put it that way, in a gentle kind of way. This is how we would experience climate change. We won't experience it with change of weather. We'll experience it with dangerous volatility, that threatens our political stability and our ability to continue to create resources and wealth for our citizens, to continue to give them healthcare, jobs, food, and some sort of livelihood. These things don't work well in a world of extreme volatility. Unless we deal with these things, we consign ourselves to a century of increasingly severe volatility. Now, we will already have this. I don't want to suggest that we can get out of the situation we're in that easily. We have failed on the fight against climate change. We will now see a world of severe volatility. What we're at a race against is now catastrophic volatility. So when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change talks about 50% reductions globally on average needed by 2030, it's not talking about avoiding climate change. It's talking about avoiding a very severe version of climate change, in which we're not sure how we will survive. It takes us into entirely uncharted territory. Already, the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are, as far as we know, at the highest levels that humans have ever experienced on the planet. And we're talking about doubling those over the course of this century, according to the current trajectory of climate change. We had 6% more emissions put in the atmosphere last year. So that's the bad news. It is a future that we do not want our children to live in. It is a future which is frankly terrifying to go forward. So that's the problem we have in front of us. In terms of solutions, the irony, of course, is that we have extraordinary availability of solutions. While we know we've got floods, war, pandemics, and famine coming towards us, the solutions are, well, from my perspective, they're investable. They are things like transport. There are things like energy-efficient buildings, where the payback period is actually about 5 years anyway, so it's a profitable, clean energy. There are land use solutions. There's strategically important minerals for the transition, the lithiums and the cobalts of the world. There's a wide range of things. There's urban farming and intense farming, which is low carbon, using renewable energy ideally. There's actually an extraordinary menu of solutions. And it's not a matter of R&D. I mean, of course, R&D, research and development, will always help the kinds of things that we're talking about and contribute to further changes. But right now, we could fix the planet tomorrow if we could muster the political will and then muster the capital to do the job. The capital, well, that is rather a challenge. We do know that the capital needs globally, and Turkey, of course, is a slice of this in commensurate with its slice of the world economy, which is now substantial and getting larger. We know that from a report that McKinsey's put out in January, consistent with previous reports, that we need to see investments of about $9.2 trillion a year, US, in mitigation investments between now and 2030. And something like 70% of this will be in emerging or middle-income markets from Nigeria to Turkey. It won't be in the G7 countries, largely. It's a huge CapEx investment pipeline that we need to generate and then execute on. On top of that, we have resilience investments because we have, as I said, lost the first battle of climate change. We will now see increasingly severe climate change come what may. We just can't stop that now, it's too late. We've got to prepare. We need to improve the ports in Istanbul to ensure that as sea levels rises, there can be no interruption to business. We need to ensure that water infrastructure across MENA, and of course we have some real challenges, Euphrates and Tigris at the moment, is commensurate with ensuring a fair distribution of water to the population so we don't have political turmoil and instability as rainfall drops, as it will. And when we get rain in places like northern India, it'll look like the monsoon we currently experience, except we expect the monsoon to fail 1 year in 5 going forward, with severe consequences for Pakistan and India. In other parts of the world, like in the US, rainfall will look like that Indian monsoon. Boston in the US is already widening its stormwater drains because rainfall is turning into big dumps and then drought in between. When the big dumps come, it needs to be able to manage the rainfall that comes off the streets without flooding the city. They're changing the infrastructure already. These are the sort of resilience activities which add about another $5 trillion a year or so of capex on top of what we need to do. This is an extraordinary amount of capital that we've got to invest. The good news is that, amazingly, at this time of the world, we have the capital. We, at the moment, have more capital on the planet than ever before in the history of humankind. And that includes available capital that we have in institutional investment hands, for example, around the world, some $130 trillion of saving, about $300 trillion overall in the finance sector. It's an extraordinary amount of capital availability, capital movement. Of course, we know there are problems such as challenging exchange rates between different countries or risk profiles or whatever. But the point is the resources are there. The question is how we get resources moving to the right kind of area, how we manage the river of capital so it flows left, not right, or right, not left, in ways that benefit our public policy priorities that head off the catastrophe that we are currently looking down the barrel at. But we have the capital. That's the important. Now, it is true. The larger reserves of this capital are in Europe and the US and Japan, and increasingly in China. A small number of major economies have an excess of capital, whereas other countries and economies have a surfeit of capital. So there's a shift that we need to make between, well, certainly richer countries and less rich countries. Now, that, of course, makes a lot of sense when you consider that 70% of the capex we need to invest in transitioning to a green and climate resilient economy is in fact in emerging and growing markets. That's where the returns are going to be. So it's common sense, but the money's not flowing adequately. Sometimes it is. India, capital inflows have been growing fast. We've seen a lot of volatility in capital inflows into Turkey for macroeconomic reasons you'll all be aware of. How do we manage around those? How do we deal with those? There is also the important task of growing and educating capital pools within countries. You know, this idea of capital formation, which is essentially savings and insurance industries, creating pools of capital to meet our future needs, has been an incredibly success in so many developing countries around the world. You know, look at Chile, one of the great successes of creating saving pools. We can also work to create pools domestically, which make it a little bit easier, less at risk of inter-country capital flows. So I don't want to diminish that agenda. You know, Zambia has a fantastic national pension fund. It's just highly restricted in what it can invest in. And we need to work on ensuring that those investments can be often credit enhanced to meet the risk yield requirements of the pension fund. In every country, there's a domestic agenda as well. The key point, though, is can we make the capital flow? And there, I'm really thrilled to say we've got proof. We have, over the last few years, been building up a green and sustainable and social bond market that is now sitting at about $3 trillion US outstanding. Now, in the overall bond market, 130 trillion, this is a small slice of it, of course, but it's the fastest growing asset class on the planet by a country mile. It grew, as you can see from this chart, over the last few years enormously, and this year it'll be a similar trajectory of increase. We expect 50% increase in 2022. We had a quiet first quarter, thanks to geopolitical challenges and the Russia and the Ukraine, but we have a pickup already underway, and as a rule, it's the third and fourth quarter that are strongest in this particular thematic market. We have some amazing things happening as a result of this particular market. First, there's a growing appreciation of risk happening in parallel and supported by the market. Let me talk a little bit more about what I mean there. You've seen the work of the Task Force of Climate Finance-Related Disclosure and now the work of the Network for the Greening the Financial Systems, the association of more than 100 central banks around the world looking at risk, as the Frank Elderson, the European Central Bank board member and former chair of NGFS, says the past can be no guide to the future now that we're heading into this climate storm and rapid change. So the NGFS has developed scenario planning, different scenarios, what could happen in the context of climate, so people can start devising regulation accordingly. To head off risk, now this is not a sentiment issue, let's be clear about this. This is a clear perception of highly likely risk factors impacting on the financial stability of banks and other financial institutions. We need to certainly expose those risks, and then we need to look at mitigating steps to reduce the potential impact of those events should they come to pass. There's liquidity risk, the stranded assets problem that you've heard about. We're having a live conversation in Indonesia and South Africa now with a state electricity companies are essentially bankrupt because they've invested in coal plants which are not running profitably against renewable energy plants around, and there's effectively a bailout trying to be negotiated in exchange for closing down coal-fired power stations. But that's a liquidity risk coming forward, a stranded asset risk. We've got the impact of changes in the economy, because China in particular, and now Europe and the US, have made such strong commitments to electric vehicles. It's driven down the cost of electric vehicles. They're becoming cheaper very, very fast. We expect that by 2030, you won't see any major companies producing petrol-based cars. There'll be niche products for various reasons. There'll be second-hand cars still available, which will take the wind out of two extraordinarily large industries. The oil industry, of which 40% of all oil goes towards cars, and the parts industries. In Mexico, where we work with the investment community, the Association of Pension Funds is now actively pressing all the parts companies in Mexico that are supplying US auto industry to change their business strategy, because in the next few years, their business is going to disappear. There won't be demand for parts. When you do electric vehicle, you have hardly any moving parts. There's a big battery slab and a bit of electrical wiring on top of it. All that carburetor, the engine, all that stuff, that just goes. So there's a whole food chain which disappears in this mix. And of course, that applies to some of the raw materials too. In Europe, we are seeing strong government pressure to shift different kinds of commodities to being low carbon, notably steel, of which Turkey is a very big supplier of. We've seen the first announcements of green hydrogen fuel steel plants. ArcelorMittal is building a huge one in northern Spain, which will become operational later this year, using green hydrogen generated from renewable energy from southern Spain. And there are announcements happening all around the world along these lines. There's going to be procurement pressure as soon as that becomes available, because the cost of the green steel is marginally different. And as volume grows, it'll become much the same. And green hydrogen is now down to $1.50 with announcements of $1 a kilo price coming through, which is an extraordinary change, which changes the economics of the whole business. Turkish steel producers are going to have to adapt. They're going to find more demand, certainly amongst European steel consumers, for zero carbon steel. They'll need to shift. So what are the implications for investments in Turkey in this? This is a risk factor, nothing certain, of course, but from the point of view of the central bank, and of course, from the point of view of investors, we now need to start looking at these issues and trying to address them, look at risk mitigant steps. One of the risk mitigant steps is investing in green bonds. We now have significant green asset purchasing programs by central banks around the world, and encouraging banks like the Hungarian Central Bank that's created a risk weighting differential in the capital ratio requirements of banks if they hold green property bonds on their portfolios. There are incentives like that coming in. Of course, the area where people normally think of risk is physical risk, floods, storms, heat, the physical impact. And certainly there is a significant issue when it comes to bank property portfolios. Which areas are more likely to be flooded in future than others? Well, those areas, mortgages for homes in those areas, have a higher risk of default, fairly straightforwardly. So therefore, they've got to have a different credit rating in the system. We now have the major banks of the world washing their mortgage portfolios with credit risk analysis data tools, looking for differential risk on the basis of the likelihood of physical changes going forward, which will translate into different mortgage rates for individuals going forward. In other words, if you're living in a flood-prone risk, you're going to get a higher mortgage offer, higher mortgage rate, unfortunately. These sort of things have been happening. Moody's and Standard & Poor's and Fitch's have already integrated into their credit rating systems climate risk events. Now, who's suffering most there? Well, certainly coastal business in Florida has been downgraded drastically because of the high risk of hurricane risk, but it's emerging markets because they're the areas that are most at risk of being impacted by climate change, created in the north, affecting the south, of course. What we're looking at now is what kind of proactive steps we can outline, define, promote, including through rating agencies, that will provide guidance to those countries of what they can do to reduce their risk profiles in the context of climate risk and therefore reduce their borrowing costs. There's no doubt that whatever happens, sovereign borrowing will increasingly become affected by perceptions of relative risk in the context of these two issues. That is, the potential for the economy to be negatively impacted by physical impacts and negatively impacted by policy change. In Mexico, where the auto parts industry is such a big slice of the economy now, how that auto parts industry, or whether that auto parts industry is taking steps to deal with the transition in the vehicle fleet as a result of the manufacturers in North America, or they're not taking, will in fact, it will end up impacting on the credit risk of those companies and the credit risk of Mexico going forward. And that's going to happen everywhere. The Australian government, a AAA government, when they announced their net zero plan at the COP in Glasgow, said that, put out a report which said that global markets are moving to become preference green. If Australia didn't adopt the net zero plan, its borrowing costs were likely to go up 100 to 300 basis points. Now, that's, of course, a critical difference in your borrowing costs. And that's something that we need to be thinking about in terms of where we go with Turkey, where we go with policy, where we go with institutions in Turkey. There is guidance now coming through about what are the kinds of investors that qualify that are Paris Agreement consistent. We've been producing a taxonomy for 10 years. We call it a taxonomy. It's being used by major investors all around the world. We have about $43 trillion of US assets under management in our investor partner community. The idea of taxonomy has now become global. The Chinese Central Bank, PBOC, produced or endorsed a green projects catalogue on our recommendation in 2015. I was a member of the PBOC's Green Finance Task Force before that. The European Commission, where I've also been a member of various task forces, has now instituted a European taxonomy of sustainable finance, which came into force on the 1st of January. And multiple other countries have either produced one or are in the process of one. It's worth noting that this map is a little old. My apologies, I haven't updated it. The Russian parliament in September adopted a taxonomy of green finance, which is consistent with the European and Chinese taxonomy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So clear guidance about what qualifies is now the norm. We have some work to do to take us forward. We need to ensure that this idea of clarity about what counts as green and sustainable is now shared globally, that people fully understand what's going on, that know what the opportunity is, and can quickly tell whether they've got assets or investments or projects will qualify, and are encouraged to look at more. The steel industry, for example, needs to be encouraged to use electric arc furnaces and DRI, green hydrogen generated steel. Of course, the green bond market pricing difference that we're seeing, which is in the order of, for a AAA bond, about 2 basis points at primary. For a double B bond, it might be 40 basis points differential. That is, there is price benefit for green in the market. Because in secondary markets, green bonds hold their value. Every time there's a downturn, green bonds stay up here, which means they're a value retention tool. And Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, once said that he made money not by giving his clients yield, he made money by ensuring his clients didn't lose money. Defensive postures are the norm in fixed income investments. So an instrument that has a better value retention feature than ordinary vanilla bonds is, of course, gold dust, and that is what a green and sustainable and social bond is. And that's driving pricing benefit at primary. So for Turkish companies and banks, there are opportunities here. There are opportunities to issue in line with the taxonomy guidance that I mentioned before, that gives you a clue to what international investors are being supportive of, one. And there are many potential investments in the Turkish economy. Two, there are clear advantages in terms of access to capital, increased access to capital. Oversubscription rates for green globally are double what they are for normal bond issuance. And it's a differentiator. It's a way of getting attention. And there may well be price benefits, of course, depending on the underlying credit risk. Now, I'm not going to suggest that there's any way to get around the macroeconomic issues that Turkey's companies and banks face in looking externally for capital. You'll be talking about that at this conference, I'm sure. What I can say is that if someone is able to raise capital, this is an edge. This is a differentiator if they have assets and projects. Refinancing of assets qualifiers. A solar farm that's 2 years old is still a solar farm. It's a green asset. And of course, there is an opportunity for investors within Turkey to start looking at the risk issues involved, picking up from the work of the central banks in terms of their portfolio management. How can they weight their portfolios in a way that improves the likelihood of sustainable returns going forward in the context of the changes that we're now beginning to experience, policy and physical, and encourage their holdings to better address these kind of risks going forward. There's a lot to be done here. Underpinning all of this, though, is, let's face it, a key task that faces every government of the world. How, in our infrastructure, in our urban planning, in our industrial planning, do we shift our economies quickly to become future fit? The shape of the future is now decided. I don't speak to an investor anywhere in the world who does not believe that the change is now underway. And the President Biden's climate summit in April last year really drove this home, when every G7 economy in the world committed to strong 2030 targets, and a whole raft of other economies as well, strong 2030 emissions targets. Now, even if you discount some of them making it, it is a now global norm that measures will be taken, drastic measures to address climate change. And as a result, the world is thinking differently. The world is changing. Turkish companies, Turkish banks have an opportunity to get ahead of this change, to ride the wave of change, to raise capital accordingly. But they have a risk too. If they don't get ahead of this change, which is sweeping world economies, they risk being swamped, being buried, failing. One of the great things about this particular revolution is we've got a clear idea of where we're going. We can take advantage of the opportunities if we get our act together. Thank you for your time today. Good luck.